Today we're going to talk about Rudyard Kipling. Kipling is probably best known these days as a children's author. What are some things that Kipling wrote?
Just so stories.
Just so stories, yes, in which he tells you basically how the elephant got its trunk and other things like that. That's an especially wonderful one, by the way. If you didn't read those as kids or have your parents read them to you, read them. It's a guilty pleasure even for adults. It's really awesome. Other things that Kipling wrote. Rikki Tikki Tavi, yes. The Jungle Book. Okay, lots of great things that kids read and still enjoy today. At the time, he was actually known as being a famous poet and novelist. He wrote Captains Courageous and a lot of poetry, which are really poems for adults, not children. And here I mean that in the noblest possible way. His themes are complicated themes. They're themes about difficult trade-offs, about difficult things in life. And so you read these stories, even the stories intended for children, in one way when you're a kid, and they're very enjoyable. You read them as an adult, and you realize he's talking about things that are actually very serious themes, and saying some complicated things about them. Kipling himself was born in Bombay, but then was sent as a small child to England to receive schooling. His parents were working in India, and so he had to stay at this place where it was essentially a boarding school for children whose parents were in India. He was treated very cruelly. He remembered those as the worst years of his life. And yet, out of that, he managed to become a writer, perhaps because his surroundings were so bleak, so horrible, because his family was so far away, because he had no friends, because he was treated badly. He retreated into books and spent his time reading and then started writing. In 1907, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was the youngest recipient ever, and also the first writer in English to win the prize. And by the way, that's still true. It's not just that in 1907 he was the youngest ever. He is still the youngest ever. Roger Kimball has referred to him as the poet laureate of civilization. And indeed, civilization's requirements, its values, the conflicts that arise within it are basic themes in Kipling. What is his poetry like? Well, it's really an affirmation of a number of things, of morality, of virtue, of the values of civilization itself, of ideals in the face of cynicism. So Kipling in some ways is shaped by the attitude that we've seen revealed in writers such as Nietzsche and Shaw, and then the disillusioned after the First World War, Eliot, Yeats, and so on. But his reaction to their cynicism is to say, look, you're making a fundamental mistake. Civilization is of immense value. It's been built up over millennia, and you guys are taking it with much less seriousness than it deserves. He sees that cynicism as a threat to civilization itself. So, Evelyn Waugh, pictured there, put it this way. Kipling believed civilization to be something laboriously achieved, which was only precariously defended. He wanted to see the defenses fully manned. He hated the liberals because he thought them gullible and feeble, believing in the easy perfectibility of man, and ready to abandon the work of centuries for sentimental qualms. His point, in a way, was that, look, civilization is something that's actually very hard to construct. You might look at it, and as Shaw does, say, oh, there could be no worse criminal than someone who would create a London like the London of today. And Kipling basically would grab his head and say, are you kidding me? This is the product of millennia of human effort. Yeah, it's got its problems, but this is the best we've been able to do, and perhaps because of his background in India, he has this idea that actually the veneer of civilization is surprisingly thin. The line between civilization and barbarism is not nearly so thick as people suppose. So his reaction to people like Shaw is to say, look, you're taking a huge amount for granted that you ought not be taking for granted. In fact, what protects civilization is a rather thin crust of, well, of force to a large extent, but also of belief. And if you challenge those beliefs and mock that use of force, you are actually in danger of undermining civilization itself. So one of his main themes is the fragility of civilization. Living in an advanced society, it's easy to think, hey, civilization is somehow this machine that just keeps producing good things and good institutions. And yes, has lots of problems, but having enough to eat, actually having people who are not constantly trying to kill you, being relatively safe most of the time, and so on, all of that can be taken for granted. And he says, look, it's really a jungle out there. It shouldn't be taken for granted. It's in fact very difficult to keep barbarism at bay. What does civilization rest on? Well, on trust. on a unity of purpose, and ultimately, he says, on a willingness to use violence. George Orwell wrote that Kipling's grasp of function, of who protects whom, is very sound. He sees clearly that men can only be highly civilized, while other men, inevitably less civilized, are there to guard and feed them. And so his point is, look, we have people in a civilization whose job it is to use force against those who would destroy that civilization. Like who?
The military.
Good, the military. Who else?
Police.
The police. Who else?
Congress.
Congress. Yeah. Well, I was thinking of like security guards or bodyguards or people like that who fulfill a private protective function as well as a public one. But yeah, I mean, look, it's very interesting in a way, I think Kipling would observe, that people of all stripes, whatever their position on things like the military or gun control or whatever, walk around with bodyguards. Okay? He would say, yeah, what does that tell you? It tells you that civilization requires protection. There are forces out there that aim to destroy civilization, that seek to undermine or live off as parasites the values that civilization relies on. And so, basically, you and I can sit in a college classroom happily discussing philosophy because there are other people who, by the way, are less civilized in the sense that they're not sitting around talking about philosophy. They're actually trained in the use of guns. They're trained in the use of force. They are doing things to protect the rest of us and to make what we do possible. And that's true not just for philosophy classes, but really for most of what constitutes civilization in a society. How is it that you can actually go to the grocery store in peace? You actually engage in a transaction there. You bring your things home. You, in general, don't get mugged in the process. People don't beat you up for your money. People don't suddenly mischarge you and say, ha, stupid student. Yeah, this beef is $20 a pound for you, and so on. No, that doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? It's actually a pretty thin line between a system where that doesn't happen and a system where it does. Now, the underlying idea, as people have expressed it more recently in social theory, is the idea of social capital. There are social networks in society and associated norms of reciprocity, of trustworthiness, that we all rely on. So you walk into this classroom, for example, and you have a certain level of trust in what's going on here. In me, in the TAs, in your fellow students. You have some conception of what your social role is to be. You have some idea of the level of reciprocity and trust you can rely on. And so we have that sort of thing in all sorts of contexts of life. The exact norms, the exact level of reciprocity and so on varies. There are some places where there's a very high degree of trust. There are other places where there's a lesser degree of trust, but we adapt ourselves quickly to those different kinds of social situations. So give me an example of a kind of setting where there's a very high degree of trust, a very high degree of reciprocity, where people do a lot for you, you do a lot for them. You're basically, there are a lot of expectations, but also because of that, a lot of trust that the other people there will support you, you'll support them, and so on.
Democracy.
Well, a democratic society is supposed to be like that. It's true. It's supposed to be one where people do have a certain level of trust and a certain level of reciprocity, but there are surely some that are more intimate than just my relation to my arbitrary fellow citizen. Yeah?
A gated community, or, yes.
Okay. People living within a gated community, you might say they have expectations of each other and a level of trust in each other that exceeds the level of trust they have to just the average person. Yeah?
I would imagine a family.
A family, yes. A family ought to be one. Now, not all families are. I know of families where actually there's deep distrust and hostility and so on, but within a family, ideally, you would say, yeah, you're expected to do a lot for your brothers and sisters and parents and so on. They're expected to do a lot for you. Very high levels of trust, but also very high levels of expectation. Yeah?
UT Austin students and UT Austin community.
Good, UT Austin community. We're expected to behave in a certain way toward fellow students and so on. Do any of you get the Campus Watch? The little daily police report from UTPD? If you don't, it's really fun. You ought to subscribe. It's a neat email to read. They have a real sense of humor in writing it. But one of the things you immediately pick up on is they distinguish UT subjects from non-UT subjects. The very first thing tells you whether this is a UT student or faculty member or staff member or whatever, or whether this is a non-UT person. Why? Why would they care about that? Who cares who got drunk and who stumbled out of their Toyota, which was weaving across and fell into the fountain? Had to be pulled out by officers. To take just an arbitrary, typical one from an ordinary week. Why does it matter whether that's a UT person or a non-UT person? Yeah.
So we know whether we're safe or not.
Exactly, so you know whether you're safe or not, right? Is it just other students who are weaving around in Toyotas and falling into fountains drunk? Well, sometimes, but usually not, actually. Usually it's somebody else who's on campus for some reason. Or there's an assault. Was it a UT student who assaulted another UT student, or somebody from off campus who did that? It matters to us partly because it has to do with those expectations, those levels of trust we have in other students. So there are different levels of this. There are levels that I have toward just an arbitrary fellow citizen, somebody else who's a neighbor of mine in the same community, somebody else who is working at the same place, or somebody who's a student or a staff member here. What are some places where this is especially low, where you would find very low levels of trust, very low expectations?
Business.
Sorry, say again?
Business.
In business. Ooh, in certain business settings, yes. Now, in some business settings, no. But in some, yes. Your competitors, and are you going to cooperate with those people? No, you're going to fight them. They're your enemy. Yeah.
Congress.
Congress. Yeah, I like Congress well for this one. In fact, that's a complicated story we might get into later. But yeah, depending on certain detailed rules, at times Congress is highly reciprocal and exhibits a lot of trust, and at times not. This is one of those times not. Yeah.
Athletic competition.
Athletic competition, good. Last night, I should have been working on my online course, but what did I do? I watched the Pirates win their first, and get into the playoffs for the first time in 21 years. And it's awesome, absolutely awesome. I regretted only that I couldn't be there. Well, you'll find out later in the course. In the 1979 World Series, I was there for every game that was played in Pittsburgh. So it was very exciting. But anyway, yeah, among fans of the stadium who are on your side, right? Very high levels of this sort of reciprocity. But people who are cheering for the other team, very low level. And the same thing, team members of yours, oh yeah, very high levels. But the other team, very low levels. Where else do you find really low levels? Yeah.
Prison.
Prison, yes. You're a fellow prisoner. The prisoners get together and say, hey man, you're a prisoner, I'm a prisoner, we have a lot in common, let's be buddies. Well, actually, in some minimum security prisons, yes. There's a book that's just come out about white-collar crime and what it's like to spend 6 years in a minimum security detention facility in rural Connecticut. So there are, at such places, actually a fair amount. But maximum security prison, how much do you trust that other prisoner? Okay, not very much at all. I mean, why does it make a difference, by the way? It's not just the social class of the prisoners. It's partly, what did you do? I embezzled some money. What did you do? Oh, it was insider trading. Well, I'm not afraid that at lunch you're going to start doing insider trading on me, right? But if you're in for murder or assault and battery or something, it's like, oh, I'm in danger for you in prison. So, in any case, yes, that's a place where there are very low levels. Now, what do these things consist of? What produces social capital? Well, there are a lot of things, really. There's a question of a sense of belonging, for example. Do I feel as if I belong in this group? There are networks. To what extent do I know the other people? Have I bonded with them? Have I actually connected with them, communicated with them, and so on? The more I've communicated with other people, the more frequently I've communicated, the stronger the bonds. How about feelings of trust and safety? Is this a place where I'm pretty safe, or do I have to be on my guard? Reciprocity. If I do nice things for other people, do they do nice things for me? If I go over and say, hey, how you doing? Do they say, oh, fine, how are you? Or do they say, screw you, chump? Right? The first is a case of reciprocity. The second is a case of definitely not reciprocal behavior. To what extent do people participate in various functions, in various activities? To what extent do people have power? Is it me always telling you what to do? Or is it a question of people having power to make decisions together and engage in activities together? To what extent do people share the same values, the same norms? Or to what extent do they really have different and even conflicting values? And then finally, diversity. A certain amount of diversity is a very good thing in building social capital because it helps people actually to see possibilities, but research has shown that diversity beyond a certain level starts breaking it down. If you're too different from me, I can't relate to you at all. If you're somewhat different, well, opposites attract and enrich each other. If we're all the same, we can all just sit around saying, What do you think? Yeah, me too. So, I mean, there's not a lot to be built out of that, so you need a certain level of diversity. On the other hand, if there's too much, that's an interesting question, actually. This is sort of a side topic, but typically these days everybody treats diversity as a good thing, and up to a certain point it clearly is a good thing. On the other hand, no university has said, in the interest of diversity, we'll just have completely random admissions. We'll just have a big lottery. That would produce the most diverse student body, but nobody thinks that would necessarily be a good thing. So it's an interesting balance that has to be achieved there. But that sort of balance, that sort of trade-off is another of Kipling's main themes. It's not only very important that we develop and build up and protect this social capital that allows societies to do things, but also there really is a complexity to the moral universe. There are trade-offs that have to be made. To what extent do we value diversity as opposed to a commonality, for example, of goals and of norms and of expectations? There really is a choice between them. At a certain point, you have to think, well, yes, we're enriched by diversity, but at a certain point you might think, wait, now there are people here who seek actively to undermine the norms that got us started in the first place. And so you have to make trade-offs. You have to decide how much of that value to pursue as opposed to that other value. And that's not something that has an easy answer. It requires difficult judgments. It requires careful sensitivity. It requires what philosophers have traditionally thought of as wisdom, the ability to somehow see what a proper balance among different goods is. It also, and this is another of Kipling's themes, it requires courage. Because in choosing one thing, you have to give up something else. And so it requires courage. It's a kind of cheap thing to say, you can have it all. In the end, these are all false choices. We can have everything. No, we can't, Kipling wants to say. We really do have to make hard choices. And in pursuing this goal, we're giving up something else. And it takes courage to recognize, yeah, there's a real loss to what I'm doing now, but I'm making the choice anyway. Well, if that's right, then he says, look, there's a certain conception, a certain idea of reducing everything to just one thing that is fundamentally mistaken. Probably many of you have seen the movie City Slickers, where Billy Crystal is talking to this old cowboy played by Jack Palance. And at one point, Crystal, he's a confused guy, his life is messed up. He's talking to the cowboy and he says, the cowboy that is, says finally, look, here's what you gotta know about life. It all comes down to one thing. And he holds up his finger. And Billy Crystal says, well, what's the one thing? The cowboy says, that's for you to figure out. Kipling would say, that's utter garbage, okay? Life does not come down to one thing. There are a whole lot of valuable things. And life involves difficult choices and trade-offs among those different things. The problem, the reason that Kipling hates two-level conceptions of society is he thinks they all try to bring it down to one thing. Marx says it's all in the end economics. Freud, as we'll see next week, says it's all in the end sex, these unconscious drives. And other people say it's all this. Nietzsche, it's all the will to power. Blah, 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 blah. Kipling says nonsense. Yes, people do like sex. Yes, people like power. Yes, people like money. But does that mean everything comes down to money or sex or power or any other particular thing you imagine? No. All of those things matter, and many other things matter besides that. Things like respect, things like dignity, things like virtue. Lots of things matter to us, and in the end, we just have to make trade-offs. We have to make choices. So one of the things he does is champion the common people, and especially those who stand to guard civilization. Soldiers, the police, others who are willing to use force. He defends them against what he sees as the intellectuals who make fun of them. And so his view is that there's this tendency of people to think, I have the key, I know what the one thing is. He says, no, you don't. And moreover, your tendency to think everything reduces to the one thing makes you devalue everybody else who's protecting the rest of it. And that's a serious mistake. Well, what are some of these trade-offs that we really do have to make as individuals and as societies? What are some hard choices where in order to pursue that goal and attain that good, you really do have to give up on that other goal and no longer pursue that other good, or at least accept less of it? Where are there hard choices to be made? There is no subsequent slide where I'm going to tell you. I just want to know what your opinion is. Where do you see hard choices like that? Yeah.
The whole freedom versus security debate going on.
Good, freedom versus security. That's a place where it's very difficult. You might say, look, I want people to be as free as possible, but I also want to be safe. And you might say, yeah, so your freedom has to end at my nose because I don't want to be injured. That's a simple way of putting it, but we see that manifested in all sorts of places. What do we do in response to the threat of terrorism? How much liberty, how much privacy are we willing to give up for the sake of security? Some people will say, oh no, we don't have to give anything up, we can have it all. Kipling would say, nonsense. Of course we have to make trade-offs. In order to be safe, we have to allow people to find out certain kinds of information. We have to actually restrict certain kinds of freedom. But how much of a restriction are we willing to accept? There's no simple answer. They're all valuable things. Liberty matters, privacy matters, security matters. And in the end, it's a difficult judgment, exactly what to give up in favor of what. What are other places where we have those kinds of difficult, hard choices to make? Yeah?
Dividing your time between career advancement versus family when you're older.
Good. Career versus family. That's a personal one, and you find that's going to affect you more and more as you get older. It's already affecting you probably. You think, hey, do I want to hang out with my friends or should I be doing my work? Well, it doesn't get better. Okay, and once you have children, that adds a new level of complexity to it. But also job requirements sometimes aren't so strong, sometimes are very strong, and there are certain times when you really have to make choices. I have a friend, a very good friend, who throughout his career made the choice for career advancement. He has spent much of his life sitting in rooms, usually on another continent from his family, scrawling things on white pads. He's now very famous, and he is a great thinker. I mean, he's achieved remarkable things. But his children, for a long period of time, didn't know him. His wife left him. His children then went through a long period of hating his guts. Was it worth it? I don't know. I've tended to make the opposite choice. On the other hand, I'm not internationally famous, or at least I wasn't before this course. Maybe you all will change it. But that's the kind of choice people have to make. How much time am I going to spend with my children, with my family? How much time am I going to spend on the job? That's a hard decision that people have to make, and it affects your choice of career, and then within that choice of career, how you spend your time. Yeah?
Also choosing careers as far as like maybe I want to be an artistic person but I won't make that much money but I'm passionate about it, or I can be like an engineer and make a lot of money but not be so passionate about it.
Good, exactly. You might have that kind of career choice. You might say, yeah, look, I've got these two things I could do. I could become an artist. And that would be fun, it would be awesome. But I realize artists don't tend to make a lot of money. Or I could do this, I could go into accounting, let's say. And I'm pretty sure I could get a job and have a good life as an accountant. But I won't have much time for my art. And so what should I do? I was in a class of 12 philosophy majors at a small college where actually I went into philosophy, but almost everybody else went into law school. And they said at the time, oh, we won't really have to choose. We'll do law during the day and then we'll read philosophy at night. I said, yeah, no, you won't. And indeed they haven't, right? Because A, the law is a hard thing. It requires a lot of time. Then you have families and so on. You don't have time to sit around and read Kant in the evenings. But that was a choice that we all sort of had to make at that point. I, in a way, faced that in a different form. I thought about pursuing a career in music, but then thought, music? What are my chances? I should do something more practical, like philosophy. I didn't say I was wise in making these choices. A good friend of mine, one of my best friends from high school, decided to do the music thing. He at one point asked me to join his band. I said, no, I'm not going to do something so crazy. He ended up being in dire straits, and so now he owns a winery in California and a place in Brooklyn, and goes between the coasts and kind of goes on his earnings from having been so fabulously successful in music. So sometimes I look at that and I think, dang. Well, anyway. Oh well. Yes, that brings us to the next. Actually, this poem, If, was voted the greatest poem in the English language by readers of a British newspaper who put a poll out. It won by a very large margin. And it really has retained its interest over the years. As soon as Kipling published this, it became famous, and it remains famous today. And it expresses a certain attitude about life that I want us to think about. Think about the virtues he's holding up as the virtues you should strive to live by. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies. Or being hated, don't give way to hating. and yet don't look too good nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools, if you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose, and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they're gone, and so hold on when there's nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Now, what are the virtues? It's awesome, isn't it? Now, actually, a question I want to confront in a moment is, to what extent is this directed just at men? And to what extent are these virtues intended for women too? But let's, for the moment, just think, what are the virtues he's talking about here? Let's start at the beginning. What virtues is he recommending to you?
Balance.
All right, balance. Notice how a lot of these go in pairs. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. That, by the way, is something that you don't really appreciate until you've been in that position, where suddenly you make a decision and everybody around you is saying you screwed up, no, that's awful, complaining about you and so on. Then you suddenly read this poem in a different way. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too. So in other words, you've got to trust yourself, but when everybody else is doubting you, you don't just say, by definition I am right, you are wrong because I am me. No, you think, are they right or wrong? You think about it. And then you say, no, they're wrong, and I have these reasons for thinking they're wrong, so then you stick to it. So it's that kind of balance. It isn't just blind self-confidence. It's self-confidence, but a willingness to question yourself too and recognize, yeah, I could be wrong. To stand up for yourself when you think you're right, but to back down when you think, well, I guess I am wrong. And so on. To make those kinds of judgments and those hard trade-offs, even with respect to yourself. What other virtues are there here? Patience, yes. Persistence, endurance. Those are things that keep coming out. You've got to be willing to put up with all sorts of things that treat that minute and respond with 60 seconds, the entire minute's worth of distance run and so on. So persistence, endurance, all of those things are important values. What else do you see here?
Humility.
Well, humility, yes, okay. You've got to recognize you could be wrong. Also, you've got to meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. You can risk everything on one go and then lose and not breathe a word about your loss. No, so not only a humility, but a kind of, what's the right word for this? It's hard to sum up in a word, but a kind of equanimity, a kind of unflappable character that says, look, I can meet with success and I don't lose my head. I meet with disaster, I don't lose my head. A sort of even-keeled nature that responds to triumph and disaster somehow just the same. And not with an apathy, right? Not like, well, I didn't care if I won or lost. No, you care and you try your best. But if you lose, oh well, you pick yourself up and get back to it. Other things, yeah.
Is it meekness, maybe?
Meekness? Where do you see meekness?
Kind of what we were just talking about.
Yeah, all right, good. A willingness to say, well, like, yeah, to watch the things you gave your life to broken and go on, right? If you think of yourself as the center of the universe, that's going to be pretty hard to do. But a meekness that says, look, I'm not the center of the universe. I am in service of goals that are higher than me. And so if I see myself thrown back and everything I've done shattered, I keep pursuing the same goal, okay? I keep after trying to do what I can do. Because it's not about me and my accomplishments, it's about something bigger than me. And so, yeah, meekness in that sense, not of being sheepish and shy and just, here's my advice, son, just, don't attract any attention, never say anything in class. If the boss tells you to do something, always just say yes, never object. It's not that. It's not that kind of meekness, but instead of meekness that says, this isn't about me. This is about something much bigger than me. And I'm merely in the service of those ends that I care about. But I'm not going to be shattered, because if I lose what I've done, big deal. It's not about me. Yeah.
It's kind of, it feels like it's not valuing achievements or disasters, and everything that's really valued is determination and drive. And as long as if you lose everything in your life and you still have the determination and drive, then you can still rebuild, and it's not different.
Okay, good. Yeah, that determination, that drive. That's a good way of putting it. I was putting it more passively in terms of endurance and persistence. But you're right, it's really a drive. It's an active thing. It's not just a passive thing. It requires that you be determined and keep after the goal, no matter what you have attached, or what happens, whether you meet with triumph or disaster. And so it's really a question of, being determined, being driven to keep after your goals. Yes?
Self-respect.
About self-respect, that is true. You can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools. You can see these terrible things happening around you, and you have enough self-respect and enough of an even-keeled character to take that in turn, to not get thrown off track by that. Now, to what extent do you think he would give the same advice to his daughter? This is written by Kipling for his son. Would the advice be different for a daughter? Is being a virtuous man the same or different from being a virtuous woman?
At what time was this?
Kipling was writing right around the turn of the century. So I'm not really asking you what he thought. I don't know what he thought about that. He doesn't tend to write much about women because he's interested in the jungle, so mostly he writes about men and animals. But on the other hand, what do you think the right answer is?
I think it was time to go.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything here, drive, determination, having an even-keeled character that would be restricted to just men? Yeah, I agree with you, actually. I don't think so. So it seems to me good advice for anyone. Now, the jungle. This is the law of the jungle, his sort of motto for the Jungle Book. Now this is the law of the jungle, as old and as true as the sky. And the wolf that shall keep it may prosper, but the wolf that shall break it must die. As the creeper that girdles the tree trunk, the law runs forward and back. For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack. Explain that law to me. The strength of the pack is the wolf, the strength of the wolf is the pack. Yeah?
Without one or the other, the pack breaks down, and a wolf by himself cannot survive because he needs the security and the strength and numbers of a pack to be able to hunt and survive.
Good, exactly. And so we've seen some bottom-up and some top-down models of political philosophy. We've seen Locke say, really, it all comes from the bottom up. Rousseau say, no, it comes from the top down. He's, in a certain sense, saying, you can't divide the two. The strength of the pack is the wolf. In that way, the individualists are right, but also the strength of the wolf is the pack, is being part of that social organization. And so really, for him, these are intertwined. You can't separate them out. That's why he stresses social capital. He says, look, I am what I am. I can be what I can be by virtue of being part of a social group, and not only a social group, but actually a kind of organized social group, a state. It wouldn't make any sense for me to do what I'm doing here if we were just in the jungle. What would happen to me if I just stood in a corner by a tree and started pontificating wise thoughts? Probably nothing very good. Okay, so really the strength of the two goes together. And so really, he says, this sense of unity, this trust, this togetherness is absolutely vital to the strength of a society. Now I'm going to skip forward a little bit, partly so that we can see him defend soldiers against the mockery. He thinks it's become sophisticated opinion, even by 100 years ago, to make fun of the military, to say, look, yeah, these people really are less than civilized, it's unfortunate, wish we didn't have to have one, and so on. He writes something from the perspective of the soldier, Tommy. Yes, making mock the uniforms that guard you while you sleep is cheaper than them uniforms, and they're starvation cheap. And hustling drunken soldiers when they go and lodge a bit, 5 times better business than parading in full kit. Then it's Tommy this and Tommy that, and Tommy, how's your soul? But it's thin red line of heroes when the drums begin to roll. And so his point is basically, yeah, the very same people who make fun of the military and treat it as if it's contemptible, in fact rely on it for their own defense as soon as they're threatened. And so it's him making the point that certain people, even if they speak with an accent, even if their English isn't perfect and so on, nevertheless are the ones we all depend on for protection. They're the real guardians of civilization. Now, yeah, well actually this makes a similar point. The islanders, it's very easy, he says, to forget that. Fenced by your careful fathers, ringed by your leaden seas, long did ye wake in quiet and long lie down at ease. Till ye said of strife, what is it? Of the sword, it's far from our ken. Till ye made a sport of your shrunken hosts and a toy of your armed men. Ye stopped your ears to the warning, you would neither look nor heed. Ye set your leisure before their toil and your lusts above their need. And the result, disaster. Now, I want to finally talk about his most famous poem, maybe. Well, most famous at any rate after If, The Gods of the Copybook Headings. It was written in 1990, just after the First World War. What is a copybook? Did any of you actually have one of these as you were growing up? Yeah, they were used primarily to practice handwriting. At a later stage, they might be things in which, like as in this case, you would write down quotations that struck you as especially interesting. But in the early stages, it was really something that would have a sentence at the top that expressed some general truth, and you would copy it over to practice your handwriting. So, in my case, for example, I can remember things that would say, you know, pride goeth before a fall, and your job would be to write in cursive, pride goeth before a fall, again and again, to sort of practice your writing. Back in the old days, we used to do this a lot. Anyway, that's what he's talking about, these copybook headings, these enduring eternal truths that he thinks we have a natural tendency to want to forget. So here's an example. When the Cambrian measures were forming, they promised perpetual peace. They swore if we gave them our weapons that the wars of the tribes would cease. But when we disarmed, they sold us and delivered us bound to our foe. And the gods of the copybook heading said, stick to the devil, you know. What's his enemy here?
People who promise an ideal world utopia.
Good. Anybody who's a utopian. That's exactly right. I mean, the most obvious one is pacifists who say, look, we don't have to protect ourselves, but really much more generally, that's right. Anybody who says, hey, we can achieve this utopia. And once we have a utopia, we'll have perpetual peace. We won't have to, in fact, that's the title of a work of Kant's. Then the wars of the tribes will be over. We won't have to worry about armies and protection and all of that. He says, you're dreaming, okay? As soon as you disarm, what happens? You're a slave. Now, on the first Flaminian sandstones, we were promised a fuller life, which started by loving our neighbor and ended by loving his wife. Till our women had no more children, and the men lost reason and faith, and the gods of the copybook heading said, the wages of sin is death. What's his enemy here? Well, sin, yeah, that's one of them. Here's his worry, and I think it's fundamental to actually what he's doing in this poem. In some sense here, he's writing at the height of the women's suffrage movement, and his enemy is feminism. Now, he's not really arguing on the grounds of justice or equality or anything like that, fairness. He's just saying, look, I'm telling you, suppose a society is so committed to equality that there is no distinction in role between men and women, and women stop having many children and caring for children. What happens to that society? It dies out, okay? Society survives only to the extent that people have children and then pass their civilization on to those children. If they stop doing that for whatever reason, that society is doomed. And so if you say, but look, fairness, equality, justice, and so on, he's basically saying, look, I'm just telling you, if nobody's doing this, nobody's having children, nobody's raising children, you're doomed, okay? Think about the Shakers. It was a religious movement that believed that all sex was immoral. What happened to them? They wrote some good songs, made some good furniture, and then died out, right? Because guess what? If there are no little baby Shakers, then in the next generation, there are no adult Shakers either. And so his point is like, look, I'm not criticizing, he doesn't take a stand on women's suffrage or any other particular movement over equality. He's just saying, look, passing our civilization on to the next generation is maybe the most important thing we do to survive. And if nobody's doing it, we're in trouble. Here's another one. In the Carboniferous epoch, we were promised abundance for all. by robbing selected Peter to pay for collected Paul. But though we had plenty of money, there was nothing our money could buy. And the gods of the copybook heading said, if you don't work, you'll die. Who's the enemy here? Well, the socialists, right? Anyway, he ends this way. As it will be in the future, it was at the birth of man. There are only 4 things certain since social progress began: that the dog returns to his vomit, and the sow returns to her mire, and the burnt fool's bandaged finger goes wobbling back to the fire. And after all this is accomplished and the brave new world begins, when all men are paid for existing and no man must pay for his sins, as surely as water will wet us, as surely as fire will burn, the gods of the copybook headings with terror and slaughter return. So his point is really that there are these enduring truths, but there's also an enduring tendency to forget them, to not worry about them. The fool's bandaged hand goes wobbling back to the fire. And so we see civilization as caught in this, if you want to think of it this way, this pendulum swinging, where these truths are, through hard experience, remembered and then gradually forgotten and have to be relearned. Well, that's a perhaps bleak vision, but he would think a hopeful vision in that we already know what we have to do. We just have to get back to those fundamental truths. Next time we'll see British philosophers in Cambridge and Oxford responding to the same set of problems.